The day I lost the woman I loved was the day I finally understood that being rich and being happy were never the same thing. The rain tapped softly against the tall hospital windows as I stood alone beneath the pale glow of fluorescent lights. At 38 years old, Ethan Blackwood, billionaire investor, founder, and one of the most recognizable names in New York City, I had spent my entire life believing that success could solve any problem. Money opened doors. Money bought time. Money fixed mistakes. At least, that was what I had always told myself. Yet there I stood, holding a worn envelope in my trembling hands, staring at words that had changed everything. The paper was old now, the edges slightly bent from being opened too many times. I knew every sentence by heart, every curve of her handwriting, every pause between the words. Still, I read it again. I always did, because somehow it felt like hearing her voice one more time. Outside, the city continued without me. Yellow taxis moved through wet streets. Office towers stretched into the dark sky. Millions of people lived their lives beneath the glow of Manhattan lights. But inside that hospital hallway, time seemed frozen. 3 years earlier, none of this would have mattered to me. 3 years earlier, I would have been sitting in the back of a Blacktown car, reviewing acquisition reports while my assistant scheduled meetings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. 3 years earlier, I measured success in stock prices and headlines. I measured people by what they could offer. Relationships were transactions. Conversations were opportunities. Even kindness felt like an investment with an expected return. That version of me would have laughed if someone suggested that a single woman could change the course of my entire life. He would have called it unrealistic, sentimental, weak. The truth was much simpler. That version of me had never met Claire Bennett. My phone vibrated in my pocket. For a moment, I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. Probably another executive looking for approval on a deal. Another board member wanting answers. Another problem that could supposedly only be solved by me. The screen lit up with 12 missed calls. I silenced it without reading the names. For the first time in years, none of it felt important. Not the companies. Not the private jets. Not the luxury penthouse overlooking Central Park. Not even the billions attached to my name. Funny how quickly priorities change when life reminds you what actually matters. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Across the hallway, a nurse walked past pushing a cart. Somewhere nearby, a monitor beeped steadily. The scent of coffee drifted from the waiting area. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people. The kind of world I used to pass by without noticing. Claire noticed those things. She noticed everything. The tired cashier working a double shift. The lonely elderly man sitting by himself in a diner. The child struggling to carry a backpack that looked too heavy for small shoulders. She saw people. Really saw them. And somehow, over time, she taught me to see them too. I walked toward the large hospital window overlooking the city. Raindrops slid down the glass, blurring thousands of lights into rivers of gold. My reflection stared back at me. The expensive suit. The silver watch. The face that had appeared on magazine covers more times than I could count. To the world, I still looked exactly the same. But the man staring back at me was no longer the man I used to be. And the reason for that change began 3 years earlier with a spilled cup of coffee and a woman who wasn't impressed by my name. 3 years earlier, my mornings followed the same pattern with mechanical precision. Wake up at 5:30. Review market reports before sunrise. Answer emails during breakfast. Sit through meetings that determine the future of companies most people would never hear about. By 8 o'clock, I was already surrounded by advisors, executives, and analysts who treated every word I spoke like it carried the weight of law. That Tuesday began no differently. The city outside my penthouse windows glowed beneath a pale gray sky, while Manhattan slowly came to life. Traffic crawled through the streets below. Ferry horns echoed across the river. Somewhere down there, millions of people were beginning ordinary days. I barely noticed. My driver dropped me outside Blackwood Capital headquarters at 7:45. The glass tower rose 60 stories into the sky, reflecting clouds across its polished surface. Employees hurried through revolving doors, clutching coffee cups and tablets. Most nodded nervously as I passed. Some avoided eye contact altogether. I had spent years building a reputation for excellence. Unfortunately, excellence often arrived wearing the mask of intimidation. Inside the elevator, my assistant Sarah reviewed the day's schedule. 3 investor meetings. One acquisition negotiation. A charity luncheon I had no interest in attending. By the time she finished speaking, I had already stopped listening. Numbers filled my thoughts. Deadlines. Contracts. Profit projections. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the lobby. Someone had recently arranged white orchids near the reception desk. I remember noticing them because Claire later told me flowers should never exist only as decoration. At the time, I thought that was a ridiculous thing to say. I walked toward the conference room while scrolling through messages on my phone. Another deal worth $80 million was waiting for approval. The board expected an answer before noon. My attention stayed fixed on the screen as I crossed the lobby. That was my first mistake. The second happened 3 seconds later. A blur of movement appeared from the hallway on my right. Then came the collision. Hot coffee splashed across the front of my charcoal suit. The paper cup slipped from startled fingers and hit the marble floor. Several people gasped. A receptionist froze behind her desk. Somewhere nearby, a printer stopped humming as if the entire building had decided to hold its breath. I lowered my phone slowly and looked up. Standing directly in front of me was a woman with light brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail and eyes the color of a summer storm. She wore a simple navy cardigan, comfortable shoes, and an expression that suggested she was more annoyed with herself than frightened of me. Most people became nervous when they recognized who I was. She did not. She glanced at the stains spreading across my suit jacket and winced. "Well," she said, releasing a slow breath, "that is definitely not how I planned to start my morning." I stared at her. She stared right back. No panic. No apology marathon. No desperate attempt to impress me. Just honesty. Around us, silence stretched through the lobby. Then she looked down at the empty coffee cup, back up at me, and said something nobody had ever said before. "You were looking at your phone. I was looking at the elevator. I think we both deserve partial blame." For a moment, I honestly wondered if she knew who I was. Most people did. In New York, avoiding my face was nearly impossible. Business magazines, financial news, interviews, conference stages. Yet there was no recognition in her eyes. Only mild frustration and the kind of calm confidence that seemed completely out of place in my building. Around us, employees remained frozen. Sarah looked like she was preparing for a disaster. The receptionist stared at the coffee stain on my suit as if it might cost her job somehow. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The woman finally broke the silence. "Do you always stand in the middle of walkways while reading emails?" she asked. I blinked. Nobody talked to me like that. Not executives. Not investors. Certainly not strangers. "Do you always spill coffee on people before introducing yourself?" I replied. One corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "Only on Tuesdays." A few nervous laughs escaped from nearby employees before immediately dying out. I noticed them glance toward me, waiting to see how I would react. For years, people had treated me like a walking performance review. One wrong expression from me could ruin an entire morning. The woman seemed completely unaware of that fact. Or maybe she simply did not care. She offered her hand. "Claire Bennett." I looked down at it, then back at her. "Ethan Blackwood." The reaction I expected never came. No widened eyes. No sudden change in posture. No awkward attempt to impress me. Instead, she nodded once. "Nice to meet you, Ethan. I would offer to buy you another coffee, but considering I technically just gave you one, I think we are even." Sarah nearly choked. I could hear it. Claire turned toward her. "Sorry about the floor." Then she bent down and started picking up the empty cup herself. Before anyone could stop her, she grabbed a handful of napkins from a nearby counter and crouched beside the spill. The absurdity of it caught me off guard. Here was a woman cleaning coffee off imported Italian marble while half my executive team watched in stunned silence. "Maintenance will handle it," I said. "Probably." She continued wiping the floor. "But I made the mess. Seems fair." Fair. It was such a simple word. Yet I realized I had not heard it used sincerely in years. Most conversations in my world revolved around leverage, influence, advantage, and strategy. Fairness rarely entered the equation. Claire stood and tossed the napkins into a trash can. "There." Slightly less embarrassing. Then she glanced at the large tote bag hanging from her shoulder. Colorful construction paper peeked from the top beside markers and folders. Definitely not the belongings of a corporate executive. "You work here?" I asked. "No, then why are you in my building?" "Because the Blackwood Foundation invited me." That surprised me. The foundation existed under my company umbrella, but I rarely involved myself in its smaller community programs. Claire noticed my expression. I run literacy projects for public schools in Queens. Apparently, somebody thought I should present ideas at today's education committee meeting. She paused before adding, although after this entrance, my chances are probably not great. I found myself studying her more carefully. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance in the way magazines defined extraordinary. No designer clothes. No expensive jewelry. No carefully crafted image. Yet somehow she seemed more genuine than almost anyone I had spoken to in years. Claire adjusted the strap on her shoulder and started walking toward the elevator. Then she stopped and looked back at me. For what it is worth, Ethan, life gets a lot easier when you look up from your phone once in a while. And with that, she disappeared into the elevator, leaving me standing in the lobby while her words echoed louder than any boardroom presentation ever had. The rest of that morning should have erased Claire Bennett from my thoughts. I had meetings stacked back to back, lawyers waiting for signatures, investors expecting decisions, a video conference with partners in California. Normally, work consumed everything. It was easier that way. Numbers behaved predictably. People did not. Yet sometime around 11:15, while an executive explained a quarterly growth projection on a giant screen, I found myself wondering how a public school literacy coordinator had managed to walk into my building and speak to me as if I were completely ordinary. The thought irritated me more than it should have. By noon, I had almost convinced myself I would never see her again. Then the charity luncheon started. The event occupied the 32nd floor ballroom overlooking the Hudson River. White tablecloths covered dozens of tables. Large windows flooded the room with natural light. The city's skyline stretched for miles beyond the glass. Usually, I attended these events out of obligation. Smile for photographs. Shake hands. Deliver a prepared speech. Write a check. Leave. Simple. Predictable. Sarah handed me a folder as guests filtered into the room. The education committee presentations begin in 10 minutes, she said. The woman from Queens is presenting third. I looked up. The coffee woman? Sarah blinked. Claire Bennett. The fact that I remembered her immediately annoyed me even more. 15 minutes later, I sat near the back of the room while presenters took turns discussing budgets, programs, and funding requests. Most spoke in polished corporate language designed to impress donors. Charts appeared on screens. Statistics filled the air. Everything sounded professional. Everything sounded forgettable. Then Claire stepped onto the stage. She wore the same navy cardigan, the same comfortable shoes, the same complete lack of interest in impressing wealthy people. Instead of opening with numbers, she placed a photograph on the screen behind her. A little girl sat on the steps of a school library holding a book nearly as large as her lap. This is Madison, Claire said. She is 9 years old. Last year she told me she hated reading because she thought she was bad at it. The room grew quiet. Claire continued. She was not bad at reading. She simply needed someone to believe she could learn. No fancy language. No corporate buzzwords. Just a story. Another photograph appeared. Then another. Children reading. Volunteers teaching. Families gathering at community events. Every image felt real. Honest. Human. By the end of her presentation, nobody seemed interested in spreadsheets anymore. They were interested in people. When applause filled the room, it sounded different from the polite applause that had greeted everyone else. It sounded earned. Afterward, several donors approached her immediately. Claire thanked them politely, but never changed. She never became overly eager, never chased attention, never treated wealthy people as if they were more important than anyone else. Watching her was strangely fascinating. Later, as guests mingled near the buffet, I crossed the room toward her. Claire was balancing a paper plate while speaking with an elderly volunteer. When she noticed me approaching, she smiled. "Good news," she said. I managed to get through an entire presentation without spilling anything. The volunteer laughed. I did not. Not because the joke was bad. Because I realized something unsettling. I was actually looking forward to hearing whatever she said next. Most people spent their time trying to get closer to me. Claire seemed determined to do the exact opposite. After the luncheon ended, I expected her to linger with donors and executives. That was what everyone else did. Instead, she gathered her folders, thanked the volunteers, and headed for the elevator as if she had somewhere more important to be. Maybe she did. Before I could talk myself out of it, I crossed the room and caught up with her near the lobby. Leaving already? I asked. Claire glanced at the large clock on the wall. I have a reading program in Queens at 3 o'clock. You are turning down conversations with potential donors? She smiled. The kids are already expecting me. The answer should not have surprised me. Somehow it did. Outside, the afternoon air carried the scent of rain, even though the sky remained clear. Black cars lined the curb. People hurried along the sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases. New York moved at its usual relentless pace. Claire adjusted the strap of her tote bag and started toward the subway entrance across the street. Wait, I said. She stopped. What? I would like to see your program. Her eyebrows lifted. Why? It was a fair question. The truth was, I did not have a good answer. Curiosity felt embarrassingly inadequate. Because your presentation was impressive. That sounds suspiciously like a business answer. I laughed before I could stop myself. A genuine laugh. The sound surprised both of us. Claire studied me for a moment. Have you ever visited one of the schools your foundation supports? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Not personally. That is what I thought. There was no judgment in her voice. Somehow that made the observation hit harder. 24 hours earlier, I would have defended myself, explained how busy I was, listed responsibilities and obligations. Instead, I found myself asking, can I come? Claire looked toward the subway stairs, then back at me. You really want to spend your afternoon in a public school library? I think so. Interesting. 30 minutes later, I sat in the back of a school bus yellow library in Queens while 20 children argued passionately about their favorite books. The room smelled faintly of crayons, paper, and old wooden shelves. Sunlight poured through wide windows. Posters covered the walls. Nothing about the space resembled the polished boardrooms where I normally spent my days. Claire stood near a reading circle, helping a nervous boy sound out difficult words. She knelt beside him patiently, encouraging him through every sentence. The smile on his face when he finally finished the page was worth more than any quarterly earnings report I had ever reviewed. For the first time in years, nobody cared who I was. The children certainly did not. To them, I was simply a tall man sitting in a chair. One little girl walked up and handed me a book without introduction. Read this one, she said. It is my favorite. Then she walked away. Claire noticed my expression and laughed softly. Welcome to my world, Ethan. I looked around the room. At the children. At the volunteers. At Claire. Strange as it sounded, the afternoon felt more meaningful than most of the deals I had closed that year. And that realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. When the reading program ended, the children rushed toward the exit carrying books under their arms and excitement in their voices. The library slowly emptied until only a few volunteers remained stacking chairs and organizing supplies. I expected Claire to leave immediately. Instead, she stayed behind helping clean up alongside everyone else. No speeches, no recognition, no audience, just work. I watched her carry boxes of donated books across the room while sunlight faded beyond the windows. You know there are people who could do that for you, I said. Claire set down a box and brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. There are also people who could do plenty of things for you. That is different. Why? I opened my mouth and realized I did not have an answer. Claire smiled as if she already knew that. A few minutes later, we stepped outside onto a quiet street lined with brick buildings and small businesses. Evening light painted everything gold. Parents waited near crosswalks. Children laughed somewhere down the block. A food cart released the scent of pretzels and roasted nuts into the air. It felt like a completely different city from the one I normally inhabited. Do you ever stop working? I asked as we walked. Sometimes. When I am asleep. I laughed. That sounds familiar. The difference is that I like my work. Her response landed harder than she intended. Because the truth was, I had spent years convincing myself I loved what I did. Maybe I once had. Maybe success had slowly replaced passion without me noticing. We reached a small neighborhood coffee shop. Claire pushed open the door and motioned for me to follow. The place smelled like cinnamon and fresh espresso. Local artwork covered the walls. Several customers greeted Claire by name when she entered. She knew the barista. She knew the owner. She even knew an elderly man reading a newspaper near the window. You know everybody, I observed. Not everybody. It feels like everybody. Claire accepted a cup of tea and sat across from me at a small wooden table. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Outside, traffic rolled past slowly. Inside, Soft music drifted through hidden speakers. It was strangely peaceful. Then Claire asked a question nobody had ever asked me. Are you happy? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it felt absurd. People asked about my companies, my investments, my net worth, my future plans. Nobody asked if I was happy. That is a complicated question, I finally said. Usually that means no. You answered pretty quickly. I spend my days working with children, she replied. They tend to simplify things. I looked down at the table. The wood was scratched from years of use. A tiny crack ran across one corner. Imperfect, real, somehow more memorable than the polished conference tables in my office tower. Claire wrapped both hands around her tea. You know what I think? She asked softly. I think you have spent so much time building a successful life that you forgot to build a meaningful one. For a moment, I could not speak. Not because she was being cruel, because part of me feared she was right. And as we sat there while evening settled over Queens, I realized her words would follow me long after that conversation ended. That night, Claire's question followed me home. It sat beside me in the back of the town car, while Manhattan lights blurred past rain-speckled windows. It waited for me inside the elevator that climbed toward my penthouse. It lingered in the silence of rooms so large they often felt empty despite their luxury. Are you happy? Such a simple question. Such a dangerous one. For years, I had measured my life through achievements. Every milestone led to another target. Every success created a new expectation. The company grew. The investments multiplied. The headlines became larger. Yet standing alone in my kitchen after midnight, I realized I could not remember the last time I had felt genuinely content. I poured a glass of water and stared out across Central Park. Thousands of lights shimmered below. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Claire was probably asleep. Tomorrow she would wake up and return to her students. She would help children learn. She would improve lives. She would matter to people in ways that had nothing to do with money. The thought refused to leave me. The following morning began with another board meeting. 12 executives gathered around a polished conference table while screens displayed charts and projections. Normally, I dominated these meetings. Every detail received my full attention. Every number mattered. This time was different. Halfway through a presentation, I found myself staring at a photograph hanging on the wall behind the speaker. A sailboat drifting across calm water. I had walked past that photograph hundreds of times without noticing it. Now I wondered who had chosen it. The question seemed ridiculous. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah appeared on the screen. The literacy program from Queens sent additional funding proposals. For some reason, seeing Claire's name instantly sharpened my focus. I opened the file. Instead of complicated financial language, the first page contained photographs. Children reading. Families attending community events. Volunteers helping students after school. Every image carried the same quiet message. People mattered. Numbers served people, not the other way around. By noon, I made a decision that surprised even me. I canceled 2 afternoon meetings. Sarah looked genuinely concerned. Are you feeling all right? She asked. Why does everyone keep asking that? Because you have never voluntarily canceled a meeting in 8 years. Fair point. An hour later, I found myself back in Queens. Claire stood outside a community center unloading boxes from her car. Her expression shifted from surprise to suspicion when she saw me. Should I be worried? She asked. Possibly. That is not reassuring. I picked up one of the boxes. I thought you might need help. Claire stared at me for several seconds. You crossed the city to carry books? When she said it out loud, the idea sounded absurd. Yet somehow it felt right. She shook her head and laughed softly. You are a very strange billionaire, Ethan. We carried boxes inside together while children rushed through the halls laughing and talking. The building buzzed with life. Real life. Not presentations. Not contracts. Not negotiations. For the first time in years, I spent an afternoon doing something that generated no profit whatsoever. And strangely enough, I enjoyed every minute of it. Over the next several weeks, something unexpected happened. Visiting Queens stopped feeling like an interruption and started feeling like part of my routine. At first, I told myself I was there because of the foundation. Because understanding our programs would make me a better leader. Because community engagement mattered. All reasonable explanations. All completely untrue. The truth was much simpler. I wanted to see Claire. One Thursday afternoon, I arrived at the community center carrying a stack of donated books. The moment I stepped through the door, 3 children ran toward me. Mr. Ethan, one of them shouted. You missed Tuesday. Another pointed an accusing finger. We thought you quit. I looked at Claire, who was standing across the room organizing supplies. She was trying very hard not to laugh. Apparently I have attendance requirements now, I said. Apparently you do, she replied. There was something warm about the way she smiled. Not impressed, not intimidated, just happy to see me. That feeling stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Later, after the children left, we sat on the front steps of the building watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Cars moved slowly along the street. A dog barked somewhere nearby. For once, neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. Can I ask you something? Claire said. Of course. What were you like before all of this? I knew what she meant. Before Queens. Before libraries. Before community centers. Before her. I stared at the sidewalk for a moment. Focused. Claire laughed. That is a very polite answer. Fine. Obsessive. Better. I leaned back against the railing. My father built everything from nothing. He believed success was the only thing that mattered. If you were not moving forward, you were falling behind. Claire listened quietly. And your mother? The question caught me off guard. She died when I was 19. Claire's expression softened immediately. I am sorry. I nodded. After that, work became easier than dealing with everything else. The words came out before I could stop them. I rarely talked about my past. Almost never. Yet sitting beside Claire felt different. Comfortable. Safe. You built walls, she said gently. I built companies. Same thing. I laughed despite myself. You always do that. Do what? Make uncomfortable truths sound obvious. Claire smiled toward the horizon. That is because most truths are obvious. We just spend a lot of energy avoiding them. For a while, neither of us spoke. The evening breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass from a nearby park. Children played basketball in the distance. The sounds felt strangely peaceful. Then Claire looked at me and asked, when was the last time you did something simply because it made you happy? I searched for an answer. Minutes passed. Nothing came. That was when I realized how long it had been. And judging by the sadness in Claire's eyes, she realized it too. The next mistake I made came from a place that I genuinely believed was kindness. Looking back, that almost made it worse. A week after that conversation on the community center steps, I learned that Claire's literacy program was struggling. The building needed repairs. Several after-school programs were operating with limited supplies. Volunteers were stretching every dollar they had. To me, the solution seemed obvious. Money could fix the problem. That was how my world worked. Problems appeared. Resources solved them. Simple. Efficient. So I made a few phone calls. Within 48 hours, contractors arrived to inspect the building. New computers were ordered. Additional funding was approved. By Friday afternoon, the program had received more support than it had seen in years. I expected Claire to be happy. I expected gratitude. Maybe even excitement. Instead, I found her standing alone inside the library with her arms folded tightly across her chest. The moment I walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. You did this? She asked. Her voice was calm, but something underneath it felt different. If you mean the funding, yes. Without talking to me first, I hesitated. I wanted to help. Claire looked away for a moment. Sunlight filtered through the windows behind her, casting long shadows across the floor. Children laughed somewhere down the hallway. Normally, those sounds made the building feel warm. Today, they only highlighted the distance growing between us. Do you know what the problem is, Ethan? She asked quietly. The program needed support. That is not the problem. I frowned. Then what is? Claire stepped closer. You never asked what we actually needed. The words landed harder than I expected. The building needed repairs. Yes. The computers were outdated. Yes. Then what is wrong? She exhaled slowly. You saw a problem and immediately tried to rescue it. You never stopped long enough to understand it. I stared at her. I was trying to help. I know. Her expression softened slightly. That is why I am not angry about the money. Then why are you angry? Claire looked directly into my eyes. Because you treated people like a project instead of partners. Silence filled the room. The truth was, I had spent my entire adult life solving problems through authority, through resources, through action. Nobody had ever told me that helping could sometimes become controlling. Nobody except Claire. I thought you would be happy, I admitted. I am grateful for the support. She paused. But I wanted you to trust us enough to include us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could feel disappointment hanging between us like a storm cloud. Not disappointment in the funding. Disappointment in me. Somehow that hurt more than I expected. Finally, Claire picked up a stack of books from a nearby table. You cannot solve everything with money, Ethan. Maybe not. Definitely not. She gave me a sad smile. Some things require listening first. Then she walked toward the hallway, leaving me standing alone among shelves filled with books and lessons I still had not fully learned. After that day, Claire became harder to reach. Not because she was avoiding me completely. She still answered messages, still responded when I called. But something had changed. A distance existed where comfort used to be. The easy conversations disappeared. The spontaneous laughter became rare. For the first time since we met, I felt the consequences of my own actions. A week passed, then another. I threw myself back into work, hoping familiar routines would silence the growing emptiness. They did not. The board meetings felt longer. The presentations felt meaningless. Even the victories seemed strangely hollow. One Friday evening, I stood inside my office overlooking Manhattan while the city glowed beneath a blanket of rain. The deal everyone had celebrated that morning was expected to generate hundreds of millions in revenue. A younger version of me would have considered it a perfect day. Instead, all I could think about was the fact that Claire had not answered my last message. My phone remained silent on the desk. The realization was embarrassing. Somewhere along the way, she had become the first person whose opinion mattered more to me than public approval. More than investors. More than headlines. More than success itself. Around 7 o'clock, Sarah stepped into my office carrying a folder. She stopped immediately when she saw the untouched dinner sitting on the conference table. "You are still here?" she asked. "Apparently." She studied me carefully. "You miss her." I looked up. Was it that obvious? "To everyone except you." That answer lingered long after she left. The following afternoon, I drove to Queens without calling ahead. The community center parking lot was half empty. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as I sat in the car for several minutes, gathering enough courage to walk inside. The irony was impossible to ignore. I negotiated billion-dollar agreements without hesitation. Yet one conversation with Claire Bennett suddenly felt terrifying. Inside, the building buzzed with activity. Volunteers moved supplies between classrooms. Children worked on art projects at folding tables. The familiar sounds instantly made me feel calmer. Then I spotted Claire at the far end of the room, helping a student organize books. She looked up. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Finally, she walked toward me. "Ethan." Her voice was warm but cautious. "Claire." An awkward silence followed. We had never needed one before. "Can we talk?" I asked. She glanced toward the children, then nodded. A few minutes later, we stood outside beneath the covered entrance while rain fell steadily beyond the sidewalk. The air smelled fresh and clean. Claire folded her arms against the cool breeze. "You know," I said quietly, "I spent most of my life believing that helping people meant fixing things for them." She listened without interrupting. "You were right. I did not ask what you needed. I decided I already knew." Claire looked down for a moment. "That is what worried me." "I know." I took a slow breath. "And I am sorry." The rain continued falling around us. Cars passed through puddles. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet none of them felt ordinary to me. Because standing there, I realized something that frightened me more than failure ever had. I was no longer afraid of losing money. I was afraid of losing her. Claire accepted my apology, but something even more important happened after that conversation. She stopped treating me like a project that needed fixing. And for the first time in my life, I stopped treating myself like one too. The weeks that followed felt different. Not because my problems disappeared, not because life suddenly became simple, but because I began making choices that had nothing to do with money, status, or expectations. One Monday morning, I shocked my executive team by declining a speaking engagement in Los Angeles. On Wednesday, I skipped an investor dinner and attended a student reading competition instead. By Friday, several financial reporters were speculating that I was changing my priorities. They were right. I was. The strange part was that Claire had never asked me to do any of it. She never demanded change, never gave ultimatums, never tried to reshape my life. She simply lived according to values that made me question my own. One afternoon, I arrived at the community center carrying a box of donated books. A little girl named Sophie immediately grabbed my hand and dragged me toward a reading circle. You are late, she announced. I was 5 minutes late. That is still late. Claire overheard the exchange and laughed. She has a point. For the next hour, I sat on a tiny chair reading stories to children who cared far more about dragons and talking animals than business success. At some point, I glanced across the room and found Claire watching me. There was something different in her expression. Not surprise. Not skepticism. Pride. The realization caught me off guard. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, we walked through a nearby park. Leaves drifted across the pathway in the cool autumn breeze. Streetlights cast golden reflections across damp sidewalks. The city felt quieter than usual. You seem happier, Claire said. Do I? Yes. I considered the question. I think I am. She smiled softly. Good. We continued walking. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence felt comfortable, natural. Then Claire stopped beside a small pond reflecting the city lights. Can I tell you something? She asked. Anything. She looked out across the water. When I first met you, I thought you were lonely. The honesty made me laugh. You figured that out quickly. It was obvious. That is slightly insulting. It is also true. I shook my head. Fair enough. Claire turned toward me. The difference now is that you are finally letting people know who you are. The words settled somewhere deep inside me. Because for years, I had hidden behind success. Behind titles. Behind accomplishments. Very few people actually knew me. Somehow Claire had seen through all of it almost immediately. As we stood there beneath the glow of streetlights, I realized something else. The life I had spent years building no longer felt complete without her in it. And for the first time, that truth did not scare me. It felt like coming home. Winter arrived quietly that year. One morning the city woke beneath a thin layer of snow, and by afternoon children throughout Queens were pressing their faces against classroom windows hoping for an early dismissal. I found myself smiling at things I never used to notice. The first snowfall, the smell of hot chocolate drifting from small cafes, the excitement in a child's voice when they discovered a new favorite book. Claire noticed the change before I did. You are paying attention now, she told me one evening as we walked through a neighborhood holiday festival lit by strings of white lights. Families moved between booths carrying cups of cider. Music floated through the cold air. Everywhere I looked, people seemed connected to one another in ways I had spent years overlooking. Maybe you were right, I admitted. About what? About building a meaningful life. Claire smiled but did not answer. She did not need to. A few weeks later, the literacy program held its annual community celebration. Volunteers, teachers, students, and parents filled the auditorium. Handmade decorations covered the walls. Children's artwork hung beside reading awards and photographs from throughout the year. It was not a glamorous event. No reporters, no investors, no cameras. Yet somehow it felt more important than any gala I had ever attended. I arrived early and helped arrange chairs while Claire coordinated last-minute details. Watching her move through the room, greeting everyone by name, I realized how many lives she had touched. Not through wealth, not through influence, through consistency, through kindness, through showing up every single day. The ceremony began just after 6 o'clock. Children read stories aloud. Families applauded proudly. Volunteers received recognition. Laughter echoed through the room. Then the program director stepped onto the stage and made an unexpected announcement. A new citywide literacy initiative would be launching the following year, bringing expanded educational resources to dozens of underserved schools. The audience erupted into applause. Claire looked genuinely surprised. I knew why. For months, I had quietly worked with community leaders, educators, and foundation partners to build the project. Not because I wanted recognition, not because I wanted Claire's approval, because somewhere along the way, helping had stopped being a strategy and become a purpose. After the ceremony ended, people gathered throughout the auditorium celebrating the news. Claire found me standing near the back wall. Her eyes glistened slightly beneath the warm lights. You knew about this, she said softly. I nodded. For a while. And you never told me? I wanted the work to matter more than the announcement. For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then she laughed through what looked suspiciously like happy tears. You really have changed. The words settled over me like the first snowfall of winter. Not because they felt like praise, because they felt true. As conversations continued around us and children raced between tables collecting cookies, Claire reached for my hand. The gesture was simple, natural. Yet it meant more than any award I had ever received. Standing there beside her, surrounded by ordinary people living ordinary lives, I realized I no longer missed the person I used to be. 3 years later, I stood once again in that hospital hallway holding Claire's letter in my hands. The same letter I had read so many times that the paper had softened at the edges. The rain still traced slow paths down the windows. The city still moved beyond the glass. But everything else was different. The man standing there was not the man who had walked through the lobby of Blackwood Capital staring at his phone. He was not the man who measured life through quarterly reports and headlines. He was not the man who believed money could solve every problem. Claire had changed all of that. Not with grand speeches. Not with demands. Not by asking me to become someone else. She changed me by showing me what mattered. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. I turned and saw her walking toward me. For a second, the world seemed to stop. Even after all these years, seeing Claire had the same effect on me. She smiled the moment our eyes met. The smile was familiar. Warm. Steady. Home. There you are, she said. I have been looking everywhere. I laughed softly. I was reading your letter again. You know it by heart. That has never stopped me before. She reached me and slipped her hand into mine. A simple gesture. The same gesture that still meant more to me than any contract I had ever signed. We walked together toward the hospital exit. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing strips of pale evening light above the skyline. Across the street, families hurried home carrying groceries. A young couple shared an umbrella. A little boy jumped into a puddle while his mother pretended to be annoyed. Ordinary moments. Once, I would have ignored them completely. Now they felt like reminders of everything Claire had taught me. We stopped beneath the awning near the entrance. Can I ask you something? I said. Of course. Why did you never try to change me? Claire looked thoughtful for a moment. Then she smiled. Because that was never my job. You did anyway. She shook her head. No, Ethan. You changed yourself. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. That none of it would have happened without her. But deep down, I understood what she meant. She had not transformed me. She had simply shown me another way to live. Another way to measure success. Another way to love people. The rest had been my choice. Claire squeezed my hand gently. People become who they are ready to become. I looked at her and realized that after everything, after every lesson, every mistake, every conversation, she still saw the best in people. Maybe that was her gift. Maybe that was why so many lives were different, because she had touched them. We stepped into the cool evening air together. The city lights flickered on one by one across Manhattan. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the water. Life continued moving forward. It always would. But as I walked beside Claire, I understood something I had spent years learning. Success can build a fortune. Achievement can build a reputation. But kindness builds a life. And sometimes the most important person you will ever meet is not the one who gives you more. It is the one who reminds you what truly matters.